Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on an incredibly fascinating and, frankly, completely turbulent period, the very first era of the young Republic of Cyprus. We're going to explore the dawn of an independent nation from 1960 to 1963. It's this tiny window of time where the island was suspended between a really fragile hope for the future and an impending, devastating disaster. This three-year period is honestly a historical masterclass. It shows us, in pretty stark detail, exactly how quickly an imposed peace can unravel, and how suddenly neighbors can be transformed into bitter enemies.
Imagine this. In 1960, ordinary Greek and Turkish Cypriots were deeply intertwined, living side by side in over 100 mixed villages all across the island. Yet, just 3 short years later, their brand new republic collapsed completely into intercommunal violence and civil war. For the people actually living through it, this violence meant the sudden severing of lifelong friendships, the burning of homes, and the overnight militarization of their own streets. So the big question we've got to ask ourselves as we dive into this history today is, was this rapid collapse just a sudden, unexpected rupture, or was a systemic, undeniable hostility always brewing right underneath the surface?
Let's get into Section 1. A Reluctant Republic is Born, focusing on the 1960 independence.
So how did we get here? Well, the path to this new nation was carved through years of violence and major geopolitical anxiety. Back in 1955, the Greek Cypriot organization ECO started an armed guerrilla struggle to kick out British colonial rule. By 1958, intercommunal clashes were breaking out, and the Turkish Cypriot underground organization TMT became highly active in response. Behind the scenes, the grantor powers, Britain, Greece, and Turkey, were absolutely terrified. They were worried about a full-blown proxy war that could destabilize the whole NATO alliance in the Mediterranean. To stop that from happening, they stepped in and brokered the Zurich and London agreements in 1959, which led directly to the official independence of Cyprus in August 1960. But here's the catch. Because this state was designed largely by anxious outside powers, the Cypriots themselves were basically handed a nation they didn't really design or entirely want.
And that outside influence resulted in a highly unusual, super rigid dual leadership structure. The government was led by President Archbishop Makarios III, who was elected by the Greek Cypriot majority, right alongside Vice President Fazıl Küçük, elected by the Turkish Cypriot minority. In an attempt to force these two to collaborate and to stop either community from dominating the other, the Constitution gave both leaders substantial, independent veto powers over massive things like foreign policy, defense, and internal security. But in practice, giving both sides an absolute stop button didn't exactly foster unity. It meant that whenever a disagreement popped up, progress just completely halted, locking the young government in perpetual gridlock.
70 to 30. Keep that ratio in your head, because it was mandated by the new constitution for the public service and police forces. Think about the reality of this on the ground. Imagine trying to staff a local fire department, a police precinct, or just a bureaucratic office, but you are legally bound to a strict quota of 70% Greek Cypriots and 30% Turkish Cypriots, totally regardless of the local population makeup or who actually applied for the job. Now, the Greek Cypriot leadership viewed these quotas as entirely inefficient and practically unworkable. On the flip side, the Turkish Cypriots saw them as absolute lifelines, essential minority rights they needed to protect themselves from being politically erased. That single mathematical ratio fueled immense institutional paralysis literally from day one.
Ultimately, the new republic was fundamentally tethered to this highly rigid constitution, which was backed by international treaties, including the Treaty of Guarantee with the UK, Greece, and Turkey. And the psychological impact of all that cannot be overstated. For a lot of Cypriots, independence didn't feel like this moment of triumphant liberation. It felt like a heavily regulated, compromised second best. It was a reluctant settlement built out of geopolitical necessity, not the realization of a unified grassroots national dream. And as history repeatedly shows us, any political settlement that lacks genuine grassroots consensus is inherently fragile.
Moving right along to Section 2, Grassroots Coexistence and Daily Life, specifically looking at the harmony in the villages.
Step away from the political gridlock in the capital for a second, because a totally different reality existed out there. In 1960, there were 114 mixed villages spanning the island. That number is huge, and it reveals the vast, undeniable scale of grassroots integration. In these specific communities, Greek and Turkish Cypriots weren't just tolerating each other from a safe distance. They were sharing the backbreaking labor of the harvests, trading in the same local markets, and hanging out in the same village squares. This localized peace was organic, it was practical, and it was deeply rooted in their shared geography.
The depth of these communal ties is probably best highlighted by something called milk kinship. This was the widely accepted practice of cross-religious wet nursing. In Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures, this wasn't just a casual neighborly favor, it established sacred, unbreakable bonds. Kids who shared wet nurse were effectively considered siblings by their communities, and those ties were revered exactly like biological bloodlines. Families would also regularly act as kumbaroi, or wedding sponsors for each other's children, beautifully navigating around strict religious dogmas. It really represents a level of profound interpersonal trust that just completely defies the narrative of ancient irreconcilable hatred.
The source material gives us some truly beautiful glimpses of this shared humanity, which honestly only makes the impending collapse that much more tragic. For instance, there's a story of a Turkish Cypriot woman from the mixed village of Lepethos. She fondly recalls her Greek Cypriot neighbor, Yorgos, just joyfully dancing in the street the second he heard a Turkish song playing. Small, everyday interactions like this underscore critical reality. The village-level harmony stood in stark, beautiful contradiction to the divisive, fear-mongering political narratives being spun by the nationalist leaders.
Which brings us to Section 3, the shadow of rival ideologies, nationalisms and paranoia.
So, to understand why that amazing localized harmony failed to scale up to the national level, we have to look at the two competing ideologies that were basically poisoning the political well. On one side, you had enosis, the profound desire to unite the island with motherland Greece. This was championed by Greek Cypriot nationalists and rooted in deep historical and cultural ties. On the other side, you had taksim, the demand to partition the island between Greece and Turkey. This was driven by Turkish Cypriot nationalists whose absolute biggest fear was being politically and culturally erased by the majority. Now, these are fundamentally mutually exclusive visions, right? You literally cannot unify an island with one country while simultaneously carving it in half.
And these ideologies were fiercely enforced by underground paramilitary organizations. IOKA pushed hard for enosis, while TMT mobilized for taksim. Even after the official peace of 1960, the remnants of these groups maintained a really suffocating underground influence. They pumped out relentless propaganda designed specifically to cultivate paranoia. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling dynamic of the whole era. The greatest danger often came from within. Extremists orchestrated targeted assassinations of moderate, pro-integration voices within their own communities. They were violently policing their own people to prevent any meaningful peace, deliberately tearing down the grassroots trust that had been built in those mixed villages.
But this systemic tension wasn't just happening in the shadows, it was actively perpetuated at the highest levels of government. Even post-independence, key figures like President Archbishop Makarios continued to openly express an enduring commitment to the ultimate goal of enosis. Just imagine that for a second. It is incredibly destabilizing for a brand new nation when its own president openly views the republic's existence as basically a temporary stepping stone toward dissolving the country into another state altogether. Because leaders on both sides flat out refused to abandon their ultimate nationalist goals, the geopolitical temperature of the island never actually cooled down.
Let's look at how it all fell apart in Section 4, the December 1963 tipping point and the constitutional collapse.
The fragile structure finally shattered entirely in the winter of 1963. The first domino fell in November when President Makarios proposed 13 constitutional amendments designed to streamline the government. Turkish Cypriots immediately rejected them, viewing the proposals as a direct attack on their essential minority protections. The tension hit a boiling point on the night of December 21st, when a police confrontation in Nicosia ended in the fatal shooting of 2 Turkish Cypriots. Within days, that tension exploded into horrific island-wide violence, a really dark period remembered today as Bloody Christmas. The government entirely collapsed, Turkish Cypriot leadership withdrew, and a British officer literally drew a physical boundary in green ink across a map of the capital, creating the infamous Green Line. The human cost of this sudden collapse was just utterly devastating. Within months, hundreds of Cypriots, both Turkish and Greek, were killed in the violence. But the sheer scale of the demographic rupture, it changed the island forever. Overnight, approximately 25,000 Turkish Cypriots, which was roughly a quarter of their entire population, were forced to abandon their homes. They had to flee in terror into small, overcrowded, highly militarized enclaves just to survive. That vast network of 114 mixed villages we talked about, where neighbors had shared food and families for generations, it plummeted to just 48. The physical and emotional separation of the island had officially begun.
The trauma of 1963 and 1964 permanently severed the institutional ties of the country, and it irrevocably hardened political attitudes across the board. The shared Republic of 1960 essentially transformed into a Greek Cypriot-run administration, while the Turkish Cypriot community became heavily reliant on external support from Turkey just to maintain their isolated enclaves. The psychological green line had become just as impenetrable as the physical one. That fragile hope of a unified, independent identity that had flickered in 1960, it was thoroughly, completely extinguished.
Which leaves us with a really profound historical question to chew on. Based on everything we've just explored, did the 1960 Republic fail because its complex, externally imposed constitution was just practically unworkable? Or did it collapse because its leaders, and the powerful underground movements beneath them, absolutely refused to let go of their rival ideologies of enosis and taksim? It's a stark reminder for all of us that international treaties and rigid constitutions simply cannot force unity if the hearts and minds of the people and the intentions of their leaders remain bitterly divided. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this dive into the history has sparked your curiosity to learn even more about this absolutely critical era.